But Trent, magic and technology.
Yes.
Do we have to choose? And if you can, are there some good examples of settings which have used both? Guys, throw in the chat those if you can think of them as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's they're both really big and really complex. And I think timeline is always a big question for me too, in terms of how far involved are either of these. I think one of the things that we see with magic quite a bit is that there's not a sense of an evolution. It just sort of exists, and it's really complex, you know, and certain people have it and certain people don't. And I think it's interesting to think about, well, are there people who are advancing magic just like you'd have scientists who are exploring and advancing technology? I think too, with one of the things with technology, it's always important to think, what is this building on? Because we just don't get technologies dropped into our laps. They have to come from other kinds of breakthroughs and other kinds of philosophical advancements as well. Thinking about the relation of, you know, people within a society or people within the world or to a deity or something along those lines. Those kinds of changes in philosophy also reshape the way that people will look at the world around them, and then look at how you might be able to stick two things together. So I think all of those things are what make it both really complex, but then really fun, because I think if you think through it a little bit, bounce ideas off some other people, you can have those sort of aha moments, just like in the real world when you get an advance in, say, technology, that, you know, just something suddenly clicks. And I think being a little patient too, and thinking back of how would you get to the point at which you're at. That's one of the things I talk about in the book. When we're world building, it's important to think about the point of the present, or where the now is, right? Where there's always going to be a tomorrow, but there was always a yesterday, and 10 years ago and 50 years ago. So it's sort of important to think about where these technologies came from, and then also how long does it take to sort of like get throughout the entire society, right? Like you get something like the cotton gin in the United States, where that managed to sort of revolutionize and push us towards the Industrial Revolution, but no one really knew about it at the time, right? And it took a little while for it to sort of gather that momentum. So I think all these things are worth sort of talking about in smaller little bits and different kinds of examples. I was thinking about some works that do this well. There's a game called, I got to look up the exact title. It's Arcanum of Steamworks and Magic Obscura, which is an old school turn-based RPG.
Good name.
It came out in the late 90s. It was from a bunch of the guys that worked on Fallout 1 and Fallout 2. I believe it's available on both Steam and GOG. I've played quite a bit of it, and basically, as you're building your character, like classic RPG, you got to pick your character species and things like that. But then you kind of got to choose: are you going to go the steampunk technology route or the magic route? And you really can't. If you try and advance both, you end up being not very good at either. So you kind of have to choose which one. But it's a tension in that society. It's sort of like who's using which side of that, the steampunk versus the magic, and it's really, I think, really kind of effective. And then another one, an author that I like quite a bit, his name is Paolo Bacigalupi. He wrote The Wind-Up Girl a few years ago, which is a pretty big hit. In John Joseph Adams' book, Epic, it's this collection of epic short stories. He's got a story called The Alchemist, in which every time you use this powerful magic, it creates more of this bramble, right? So it's sort of a metaphor on how we use our technologies and how they end up affecting our environment, right? So people just keep using more and more and more of this magic, and this very dangerous bramble sort of starts to overflow over the entire kingdom. And it's almost as if people are so reliant on the magic, they don't even remember how to do things any other way. So then it becomes this conundrum of like, how do you solve this problem without using what's, you know, the thing that you use for everything, you can't use that now, and sort of getting into that headspace as well.
Very interesting. I think another great example of this, and there's no reason particularly why you would be familiar with it, but probably some of our audience members will be, is the second installment of the Avatar: The Last Airbender universe, which is called The Legend of Korra. And the idea of that is that this elemental magic that exists in the world, each person who has magic only really has access to one kind of element, and it's typical 4-element stuff. This magic drives an industrial revolution. So they have electricity because they have people who can produce electricity and put it into the grid, and these kinds of ideas. So that's a great example. Exactly, Legend of Korra. So that is a great example of a world where they have used magic to drive the progress of technology, and it has integrated in a very interesting way. And that's really what I want to talk about today. Is not just can you have both, but how do they exist in a world with both? Can you have technology which is driven by magic? Can you have magic which is improved by technology? How can they interact? Or does the one preclude the other? Does the one stymie the other, or reduce the effectiveness of the other, essentially? You see this as a trope in a lot of worlds as well, I would say, that the rise of technology is the death of magic, and magic is leaving this world to make way for technology. And it's a very Tolkienian approach to world building, but it's definitely not the only one. And I think because it's seeded so early, like Tolkien is the great granddaddy, so it's seeded in our minds so early as world builders that I think sometimes we fall prey to this. We forget that actually these are two distinct niches. These are two distinct powers that fill the same niche, which is get stuff done. Yeah, essentially, right?
Right. And that's where too, I think looking up, I'm sure Clark's Law is familiar to a number of your viewers.
Somebody just quoted it in the chat, but yeah, go for it.
The sufficient advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And that's an idea that I think is floated around through different fantasy and science fiction. There's another quote, I can't remember quite where it's from, but something along the line of witchcraft is witchcraft until you sort of understand the mechanics behind it, right? And then it just becomes a science.
Alchemy until it becomes chemistry, that kind of thing.
Chemistry, right. And I think one of the things too that I urge when I'm working with my students, because they very much go to those sort of default Tolkien, the world is progressing and there's no room for magic anymore, is to go through. So if you're not familiar with the concepts in the book, there are 14 categories across the areas of governance, economics, social relations, and cultural influences. And technology is one of them, and magic is another one that you can sort of add into that system under those cultural influences. And one of the things that I urge them to think about is whether these two things, whether they both exist or whether one is much more powerful than the other, are they equally available to everybody in the society, right? Or is it that one gender controls all of one and none of the other, or vice versa? Or is it a class thing that only dirty street urchins are the ones who have to use magic because the sophisticates use technology, right? Because they're learned and they go to school and things like that. I think those are interesting questions to start thinking about, that bit of accessibility. Is it druids way off in the forest that are doing this arcane thing that the government is trying to find out, and people are trying to police and crack down? Or is it something that's like woven into the economy, in which there's so much magic stuff, or there's people who are made, you see this all the time too in like Valyrian steel in Game of Thrones, right? It's a near magical weapon or steel that's so valuable, right, that it becomes this amazing thing that people really are seeking after. So thinking about that as well, how magic functions within the economy, whether there's a separate magic economy of like, is there limitless magic, or is it something like oil, right, where you have to extract it from some source and then maybe the magic dries up? There are lots of different examples of magic channels in the world that the closer you are to them, you can draw more from them. So I think all those questions too about who may be allowed to do it, who may not be allowed to do it, whether it's new or old. That's another thing with magic. Like, has magic been around for millennia, or is it like a recent rediscovery or redevelopment? So those things are all fun to sort of think about and then worry, because obviously we don't have magic in our world, at least not in the sense that we use in sci-fi and fantasy senses. So then thinking about how would you, and this is something too that I like to sort of talk about both in the book and just in my classes, if you add one thing new, it's not that it's just going to affect one part of society. It's going to if it's realistically done, it's going to ripple through absolutely everything. You're going to have laws about it. You're going to have an economy about it, right? There are going to be certain people who want to see more of it. They're going to see other people who want it stamped out. So,
yes, I'm so glad that you said that. And it's the mosaic approach to world building is one of the things that I spend a lot of time talking about on the channel and in my videos and in blogs and everything else, that a world is a fully integrated web. So you cannot have one thing introduced that does not affect everything unless there are extenuating circumstances.
Right.